Rain hammered the tall windows of Valmont Palace, while Eleanor Hart folded the last of her dresses into a small traveling case. She had waited until after midnight to pack. By sunrise, she intended to be gone. No farewell to the court that had spent weeks whispering her name. No final argument with the Chancellor who wanted her removed. And certainly no last encounter with the man who had become the one danger she had never prepared herself to survive. The knock came just as Eleanor fastened the case. She expected a maid. Instead, the door opened, and King Adrian Valmont stepped into her chamber. He had come without guards, without ceremony, dressed more like a restless man than a king. In one hand was the resignation letter Eleanor had left on his desk. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Adrian asked why she was running. Eleanor gave him every sensible answer. The court was watching her. The Chancellor despised her. Noble women were already saying the young governess had forgotten the distance between herself and the throne. But Adrian knew none of those things had made her pack. He moved closer. Not enough to touch her. Enough to make Eleanor wish he would. "Are you leaving because they frightened you?" he asked quietly. "Or because of me?" Eleanor could not answer. Adrian admitted he had spent weeks avoiding rooms whenever he knew she would be inside them. He had changed his dining hours, ended conversations early, sent servants where he could have gone himself. Because every time he came near her, restraint became harder. Eleanor told him he should keep avoiding her. Adrian's gaze dropped briefly to her lips. "If I stay here another minute," he whispered, "you'll want me until it hurts." Eleanor's heart betrayed her, before her pride could save her. "And what makes you think I don't already?" The silence between them changed. Adrian took one step closer, and frantic footsteps exploded through the corridor. A servant's terrified voice shattered the moment. Princess Clara was missing. 6 weeks earlier, Eleanor Hart had entered Valmont Palace, expecting only to teach a lonely little princess. She had no idea she was walking into the secret that had already killed one queen. Eleanor Hart arrived at Valmont Palace with one traveling case, 2 carefully mended dresses, and enough money in her purse to last perhaps another month. Everything else she owned had already been sold. Her father's illness had consumed what little savings the Hart family possessed, and his death had left behind debts Eleanor was still learning how to count. The small house, where she and her younger brother had grown up, was gone. Most of the furniture had followed. The only thing she had refused to sacrifice was her brother Thomas's place at school. He was 16, clever enough to win praise from every tutor who taught him, and determined to become something their father would have been proud of. Eleanor had promised that grief would not steal his future as well. That promise was the reason she stood beneath the enormous stone arches of Valmont Palace that cold October morning, trying not to stare at ceilings higher than the entire house she had lost. She was educated enough to teach French, history, literature, mathematics, and music. Her father had insisted on that much. But education did not make her one of them. The women crossing those marble halls wore silk, because they had never needed to ask its price. The gentlemen barely noticed the servants opening doors for them. Eleanor understood immediately that the palace had invisible boundaries everywhere, and a governess occupied one of the strangest positions of all. Too educated to be treated entirely as a servant, too poor to be treated as a lady. She belonged somewhere in between. Valmont Palace itself felt trapped between worlds too. There were flowers in every corridor, and sunlight pouring through enormous windows, yet something about the place remained strangely mournful. Eleanor discovered the reason before she had even reached her rooms. Queen Helena was everywhere. There she was, above the grand staircase, painted in ivory silk, beside a younger King Adrian. There she was, in the East Gallery, holding an infant Princess Clara. Another portrait showed her smiling beneath cherry blossoms in the palace gardens. 3 years had passed since the Queen's death, but no one appeared willing to move her. Eleanor noticed something else. Whenever Helena's name was mentioned, servants became quieter. A maid, who had been explaining the palace routine, stopped halfway through a sentence when Eleanor innocently asked what the Queen had been like. The woman glanced around before answering. "She was loved, miss. Nothing more." By lunchtime, Eleanor understood that Princess Clara might prove even more difficult than the palace. The 8-year-old had already sent away 4 governesses in 14 months. One had lasted 3 weeks. Another had resigned after Clara locked her inside a linen cupboard. The most recent had survived 6 days. People described the child as stubborn, spoiled, and impossible. Eleanor suspected there was another word no one seemed willing to use: grieving. Their first lesson confirmed it. Clara sat stiffly at a schoolroom table beneath a window overlooking the gardens, her dark hair tied perfectly behind her head, and her expression far too guarded for a child of 8. Eleanor introduced herself. Clara said nothing. Eleanor opened a history book. Clara looked away. Eleanor asked whether she preferred geography. No response. Then Clara picked up the small bottle of ink beside her elbow and calmly poured it across Eleanor's open lesson book. The black stain spread through 3 pages. A maid near the door gasped. Eleanor looked down at the ruined book, then at Clara. The princess stared back, clearly waiting for anger, perhaps shouting, perhaps punishment, perhaps the same reaction every adult had already given her. Instead, Eleanor dipped one finger directly into the remaining ink. Clara's eyes widened. Eleanor pulled a blank sheet of paper toward herself, sketched the quickest possible portrait of a severe-looking gentleman, then used her ink-covered finger to give him an enormous curling mustache. Clara tried not to react. Eleanor added another curl. The corner of the princess's mouth twitched, so Eleanor made the mustache even larger. For one brief second, Clara almost laughed. It was barely a sound, but someone standing in the doorway heard it. Eleanor looked up. King Adrian was watching them. The warmth disappeared from Clara's face immediately. Eleanor rose. At 40, Adrian carried himself with the kind of authority that made a room feel smaller the moment he entered it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed simply by royal standards, but nothing about him felt simple. His expression was restrained, his dark eyes unreadable. He looked first at the ruined lesson book, then at the ridiculous drawing, then at Eleanor. "My daughter requires discipline, Miss Hart, not friendship." The warning in his voice was unmistakable. Eleanor knew exactly what she was supposed to do: apologize, bow, promise to follow his instructions. She did only one of those things. She lowered her head respectfully before meeting his gaze again. "Respectfully, Your Majesty. I think she has had enough people disciplining her grief." The room became very still. Even Clara looked at her. No one, Eleanor suspected, spoke to the king that way. Adrian's expression hardened, but something else moved beneath it. Surprise, perhaps, or anger that had not yet decided what form it wanted to take. For a moment, Eleanor wondered whether her first day would also become her last. Instead, the king looked at his daughter. Clara had turned toward the window again. When Adrian finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "You were employed to educate the princess. That is what I intend to do. And you believe drawing mustaches is education?" "Not usually." Clara's shoulders moved slightly. She was trying not to laugh again. Adrian noticed. So did Eleanor. The king said nothing more. He turned toward the door, then stopped. His attention had fallen to Eleanor's throat. A small silver pendant rested above the collar of her dress. It was old and delicately worked, shaped like a tiny crescent, surrounded by curling leaves. Adrian stared at it long enough for Eleanor to become uncomfortable. "Where did you get that?" His tone had changed completely. Eleanor touched the pendant instinctively. "It belonged to my mother." Adrian looked at her. "Your mother?" "Yes, Your Majesty. She gave it to me shortly before she died." Something in the king's face closed. He glanced once more at the silver pendant, then walked away without another word. Eleanor stood watching the empty doorway. She had arrived at Valmont hoping only to keep her position long enough to pay Thomas's school fees. Before her first afternoon was over, she had already challenged the king, nearly made his daughter laugh, and somehow disturbed him with a piece of jewelry she had worn since childhood. What Eleanor did not yet know was that Queen Helena had once possessed a pendant almost exactly like it. Over the next several days, Eleanor discovered that Princess Clara learned best when she forgot she was being taught. So Eleanor stopped keeping her trapped in the schoolroom. Mathematics became a game, played with smooth stones beside the fountain. History moved into the portrait gallery, where Eleanor asked Clara to guess which long-dead king looked most likely to have started a war over something ridiculous. Literature belonged beneath the old cedar tree, where Clara could stretch across the grass, while Eleanor read aloud. Slowly, the child began to change. She still had quiet days, but she started asking questions. She corrected Eleanor when she deliberately made mistakes. Once, she even laughed loudly enough for two passing servants to stop and stare. Adrian noticed too. Eleanor often caught sight of him at a distant window or crossing the garden while Clara read beside her. He rarely joined them, but his eyes lingered longer than they had before. Then one afternoon, beneath the cedar tree, Clara closed her book and asked the question everyone in the palace seemed determined to avoid. "Do you think my mother knew she was going to die?" Eleanor went still. She had learned enough about Valmont to understand that Queen Helena's death was treated like a locked room. Everyone knew it existed. No one wanted to open the door. Eleanor chose her answer carefully. "I think your mother loved you very much." Clara looked down. "That wasn't what I asked." Before Eleanor could respond, another voice came from behind them. "That is enough, Clara." King Adrian stood several feet away. Clara immediately closed her book. Her father ordered her back inside, and although she obeyed, disappointment followed her all the way toward the palace. Adrian waited until she was gone. Then he turned on Eleanor. "You will not encourage those questions." "I didn't encourage anything. You were about to answer her. She deserves answers." His expression hardened. "She is 8 years old and grieving. I know exactly what my daughter is." "Then stop making her believe her grief is something shameful." Adrian stepped closer. The movement was sharp, born from anger rather than affection, but it brought him near enough that Eleanor suddenly became aware of everything she had been trying not to notice. His height, the tension in his jaw, the faint scent of cedar and rain clinging to his coat. For one strange second, neither of them spoke. Adrian seemed to notice the closeness at exactly the same moment. He stepped back first. "You are here to teach her, Miss Hart. And sometimes children ask questions that are not in books." Before Adrian could answer, another man approached along the garden path. Lord Chancellor Edmund Blackwood was the late Queen's cousin and one of the most powerful men in Valmont. He was polished, controlled, and almost always smiling, though Eleanor quickly decided his smile never reached his eyes. Blackwood had been pressing Adrian to remarry. The kingdom, he insisted, needed stability. The court needed a queen. Clara needed a proper maternal influence, and Blackwood already had someone in mind. Lady Seraphine Ashcombe arrived 2 days later. She was beautiful in precisely the way court portraits promised women should be: elegant, composed, and born into one of the oldest noble families in the kingdom. She also understood almost immediately that something unusual was happening between the king and his daughter's governess. At dinner, Clara was expected to sit beside Seraphine. Instead, she refused. She asked Eleanor to stay beside her. A long silence followed. Then Adrian surprised everyone. "Let Miss Hart remain." Seraphine smiled graciously, but beneath the table, her fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass. That night, Eleanor returned to her chambers and stopped in the doorway. Her wardrobe stood open. Drawers had been disturbed. Letters lay scattered across her desk. Someone had searched the room. Eleanor checked everything twice. Nothing valuable was missing. Then her hand rose instinctively to her throat. The silver pendant was gone. Eleanor reported the theft before breakfast. She expected the palace steward to handle it quietly. Instead, King Adrian appeared in her chambers less than 20 minutes later. The moment he understood what had been taken, his expression changed. He ordered the guards to search every corridor, question the night servants, and inspect every entrance to the governess's wing. His anger unsettled Eleanor more than the theft itself. It was only a pendant. Adrian turned toward her. It was not only a pendant. Eleanor folded her arms. "Then, perhaps you should tell me why everyone seems more interested in it than I am." For several seconds, Adrian hesitated. Then he told her. Queen Helena had owned one almost identical. He had given it to her shortly before their marriage. Eleanor stared at him. "That isn't possible. I know what I gave my wife, and I know what belonged to my mother. She wore that pendant before Queen Helena ever married you." Neither explanation made sense, and for the first time, Eleanor wondered whether whoever had entered her room had taken the pendant because of its value or because they recognized it. That evening, a scream came from the princess's chambers. Eleanor reached Clara's room, expecting servants and panic. Instead, she stopped quietly at the doorway. Adrian sat beside his daughter's bed. The king Eleanor knew was commanding, distant, almost impossible to read. The man sitting there was none of those things. Clara clung to his hand, trembling from another nightmare. Adrian stroked her hair awkwardly, as though he feared even comforting his own child incorrectly. When Clara finally slept again, Eleanor remained by the door. Adrian looked exhausted. "I don't know how to help her anymore," he admitted. It was the first time Eleanor had heard uncertainty in his voice. He told her Helena had been ill for months before she died. Some days she seemed stronger. Then suddenly, she would weaken again. Physicians came and went. Medicines changed. Nothing saved her. "I was king," Adrian said quietly. "I could summon armies, command ships, order roads built across mountains." His eyes remained on Clara. "But I couldn't save my wife." Eleanor understood then that Adrian had not merely lost Helena. He had been punishing himself ever since. "Perhaps Clara doesn't need you to have saved her mother," Eleanor said softly. "Perhaps she only needs to know you didn't disappear with her." Adrian looked at her. The words struck somewhere deeper than she had intended. Later, when they left Clara sleeping, they walked together through the dim corridor. For once, there was no argument between them, only silence. Then Adrian said, "Thank you, Eleanor." She stopped. He had never called her that before. Adrian seemed to realize it too. Their eyes met. Neither corrected it. A faint sound suddenly came from behind them. Footsteps. Someone was moving quickly through the shadows. Adrian turned at once and followed, Eleanor close behind. They reached the end of the corridor just as a door slammed somewhere beyond the gallery. The intruder was gone, but something had been dropped on the floor, a brass key. Adrian picked it up, his face tightened. Eleanor knew immediately that something was wrong. "What does it open?" Adrian stared toward the darkened eastern wing. "My wife's apartments." Eleanor felt a chill. Queen Helena's rooms had been locked since the day she died, which meant someone inside Valemont Palace had been entering them for 3 years. 2 mornings later, Clara announced at breakfast that she wanted to ride beyond the palace grounds. Adrian nearly refused. Autumn clouds were gathering over the hills, and he had council meetings waiting. But Clara had barely asked for anything since her mother's death, and when she added that Eleanor should come too, Adrian finally agreed. Eleanor soon discovered that royal horses were apparently expected to understand royal dignity. Hers did not. While Adrian and Clara moved neatly along the woodland path, Eleanor's mare stopped beside a hedge and refused to take another step. Eleanor tugged the reins. The horse ignored her. She tried coaxing. Nothing. Finally, she muttered that if the animal intended to embarrass her before the king, it was doing an excellent job. Adrian laughed, not the restrained amusement she had occasionally seen at dinner. A real laugh, warm and sudden. Eleanor stared at him. For a moment, the king disappeared. There was simply a man riding beside his daughter beneath the autumn trees, smiling as though grief had loosened its grip on him. Clara noticed too, and her smile made Adrian laugh again. The weather turned before they could return. Rain swept across the hills, forcing the small party toward an old hunting lodge once used by Adrian's father. By the time they reached it, Clara was exhausted. She curled beneath a blanket near the fire and fell asleep while rain battered the roof. For once, Adrian and Eleanor were alone without palace walls around them. The silence became strangely intimate. Adrian asked why she had never married. Eleanor hesitated before admitting there had once been a man. He had been respectable, comfortable, everything her family believed she should want, but he had spoken about marriage as though he were hiring someone to manage his household. He wanted obedience, Eleanor said, not companionship. Adrian watched the fire. Then he was a fool. The words were quiet, too quiet. Eleanor looked at him and found him already watching her. To escape the moment, she asked the question she had wondered about since arriving. Why had he never remarried? Adrian's expression changed. Because loving someone once was enough to teach me what losing them costs. The answer stripped away every title between them. Eleanor wanted to tell him that grief could not protect him forever. Instead, her hand shifted against the bench between them. Adrian's moved at the same time. Their fingers came within an inch of touching. Neither moved away. Then Clara stirred beneath the blanket. The moment vanished. Nothing had happened. Somehow, that made everything worse. By the time they returned to Valemont, the palace had already begun whispering. A servant had seen the king place his cloak around Eleanor's shoulders during the storm. Another had noticed how often Adrian now appeared near Clara's lessons. Within days, coincidence had become gossip. Lady Seraphine heard it too. She found Eleanor alone in the gallery one afternoon. Her smile was perfectly polite. "Be careful, Miss Hart." Eleanor met her gaze. Of what? Of mistaking attention for intention. Seraphine stepped closer. Kings may flirt below their station. They do not marry there. The insult was deliberate. Eleanor refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing it land. If His Majesty's intentions concern you, perhaps you should discuss them with His Majesty. Seraphine's smile disappeared. That night, Eleanor returned to her room, determined to forget the conversation. A folded piece of paper waited beneath her door. There was no seal, no name, only one sentence written in dark ink. "Leave Valmont before the king buries another woman he loves." Eleanor read it twice, then a third time. The warning was no longer about gossip. Someone inside the palace believed getting close to Adrian could kill her. The warning should have frightened Eleanor into leaving. Instead, it convinced her that someone desperately wanted her to stop asking questions. The following morning, she found Clara sitting beneath the cedar tree with one of her mother's old storybooks pressed against her chest. Eleanor had begun searching for a gentle way to ask about Queen Helena when Clara spoke first. "Mama used to read this one whenever she was ill." Eleanor sat beside her. Clara turned the worn book over in her hands, then frowned, as if reaching for an old memory. "She told me something once. I thought it was part of the story." "What did she say?" Clara's voice softened. "If anything ever happens to me, remember the stories I read you." Eleanor felt a sudden unease. That afternoon, she asked permission to examine the books Helena had kept for Clara. Most contained nothing unusual. Then Eleanor noticed tiny circles around individual letters, one on the first page, another several pages later, more hidden throughout the book. She copied them down in order. When the final sentence emerged, her blood ran cold. "The medicine is wrong. Trust no one who brings the blue bottle." Eleanor went straight to Adrian. He read the message twice, then rejected the conclusion immediately. Helena was ill. Perhaps she was made ill. His eyes hardened. "You are speaking about the death of my wife, and I am telling you what your wife appears to have written." Adrian turned away, struggling against something deeper than anger. The royal physicians had diagnosed Helena with a rare wasting illness. For months, they had changed treatments as her condition worsened. Eleanor asked one simple question: who controlled her medicine? Adrian went still. He did not answer immediately. Then he said the name, Blackwood. As Helena's cousin and Adrian's most trusted advisor, Lord Blackwood had personally supervised much of her care during the final months. For the first time, suspicion reached someone powerful enough to terrify even the palace. Adrian ordered Helena's sealed apartments opened. Dust covered the furniture. Her dresses still hung untouched. Flowers had long since dried inside porcelain vases. Then one of the guards discovered something beneath a cabinet beside Helena's bed, a silver pendant. Eleanor recognized it instantly, her stolen pendant. Blackwood arrived soon afterward, and his reaction was immediate. He questioned how an object belonging to Eleanor had entered rooms locked since Helena's death. Then he went further. Perhaps Eleanor's family had known the Queen. Perhaps her arrival at Valemont had never been accidental. Perhaps someone connected to the Hart family had been involved in Helena's final months. The suggestion spread through the room like poison. Eleanor looked toward Adrian, waiting for him to dismiss it. Instead, the king's face became unreadable. In front of Blackwood, the guards and several members of the household, Adrian gave the order. "Miss Hart will remain confined to her chambers until this matter is resolved." Eleanor felt the words like a blow. She said nothing. She refused to let Blackwood watch her break. But when the door of her chamber finally closed behind her, anger came first. Then disappointment. She had thought Adrian knew her better than that. Hours passed. Near midnight, her door opened. Adrian entered alone. Eleanor turned away from him. "If you've come to question me, Your Majesty, I have nothing else to say." "I haven't." She looked back. Adrian closed the door quietly. "I don't believe you." Eleanor stared at him. "Then why imprison me?" Because whoever placed that pendant in Helena's room believes I will." The anger disappeared from her face. Adrian stepped closer. "If they think you are frightened, isolated, and under suspicion, they may become careless." Eleanor finally understood. The accusation had been theater. Her confinement was bait. And Blackwood? Adrian's expression darkened. "I trusted him with my wife, my daughter, my kingdom." Now he needed proof before confronting him. Eleanor looked toward the locked door. Only hours earlier, she had been the governess the king was supposed to distrust. Now they were secretly investigating the death of his queen together. And as Adrian stood close enough that she could hear the quiet change in his breathing, Eleanor realized the greater danger was no longer simply discovering who had killed Helena. It was discovering how much she had begun to trust the man Helena had left behind. Adrian's plan depended on patience. For several days, he behaved exactly as Blackwood expected. Eleanor remained officially confined. Servants were told the investigation was continuing, and Adrian allowed the court to believe he had begun doubting her. But after midnight, the palace changed. A side door would open, a guard loyal to Adrian would quietly disappear from the corridor, and Eleanor would slip from her chambers to meet the king, somewhere no one expected them to be together. Sometimes it was Helena's old reading room, sometimes the abandoned music gallery. Their most important meeting took place in the royal library. Adrian had found records showing that several shipments of medicine ordered during Helena's illness had never appeared in the official palace accounts. Eleanor searched Helena's books, while Adrian examined old correspondence. Hours passed. Then Eleanor discovered several letters hidden behind the lining of a leather volume. They were written in Helena's hand. The Queen had been investigating the same missing medicines shortly before her death. One letter mentioned unexplained payments authorized through Blackwood's office. Another questioned why bottles delivered for her treatment were being replaced before physicians could examine them. It was the first evidence suggesting Helena's warning had not been imagined. Adrian read the letters in silence. Eleanor expected anger. Instead, she saw grief. "I should have known." "You couldn't have known what she was hiding. I was her husband." The words carried 3 years of guilt. Adrian sat beside the fire and finally told Eleanor something he had never spoken about openly. His marriage to Helena had been arranged. At first, they had been strangers, performing their duties before a kingdom. Then friendship came, and eventually love. Helena had become the person who knew Adrian when he was no longer required to be king. Losing her had convinced him that loving anyone again would somehow diminish what they had shared. Then, Eleanor arrived. "You made my daughter laugh," he said. "You argue with me when everyone else agrees, and somehow I find myself searching every room for you before I realize I'm doing it." Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. Adrian looked away. "Part of me feels ashamed of that." She moved closer. "Why?" "Because wanting another woman feels like leaving Helena behind." Eleanor shook her head. "Loving again isn't betrayal." Adrian looked directly at her. "And if what I want isn't merely love?" Everything between them changed. The crackling fire suddenly sounded too loud. Adrian crossed the small distance separating them. Eleanor could have stepped away. She didn't. His hand lifted slowly toward her face. Their mouths were inches apart when bells exploded across the palace. Fire. They ran. Flames were pouring from the windows of Queen Helena's abandoned apartments. Servants rushed through the corridors, carrying water, while guards forced open the doors. Eleanor followed Adrian inside, despite his order to remain outside. Smoke filled the rooms. Then she saw movement near Helena's writing desk. A man was feeding papers into the flames. Blackwood's secretary. He saw Eleanor and fled through another doorway. She moved toward the burning documents, and part of the ceiling cracked above her. Adrian reached her first. He dragged Eleanor backward as burning timber crashed where she had been standing. Moments later, they stumbled outside together, coughing, their clothes blackened with soot. Eleanor was shaking. Adrian looked at her as though the sight of her alive was the only thing keeping him upright. Whatever restraint he had maintained disappeared. He pulled her against him and kissed her. There was no calculation in it, no king, no governess, only fear, relief, and 6 weeks of feelings neither of them had been willing to name. The kiss lasted only seconds. Then Adrian pulled away, not because he regretted it, because he had finally noticed the silence. Eleanor turned. Servants filled the courtyard. Guards stood frozen beside buckets of water. Members of the household had gathered beneath the arches. Dozens of people had seen their king kiss his daughter's governess. By breakfast, everyone in Valmont Palace knew. By morning, the kiss had become more dangerous than the fire. Every corridor carried a different version of what had happened. Some servants said Eleanor had thrown herself at the king. Others claimed Adrian had been secretly visiting her for weeks. By noon, the story had traveled beyond the palace gates. The royal council assembled before Adrian had even finished breakfast. What had happened in the courtyard, they warned, could not simply be dismissed as private affection. Eleanor was unmarried, employed in the royal household, and far beneath the king in rank. If Adrian continued pursuing her openly, the court would see weakness where it expected discipline. Blackwood made certain the argument became even uglier. He suggested that Helena's death had left Adrian emotionally unstable, that the king was allowing grief, loneliness, and desire to interfere with judgment, and several powerful nobles agreed. They had tolerated Adrian's refusal to remarry for 3 years. They would not tolerate him risking alliances over a governess. Their solution was immediate. Lady Seraphine. An engagement to her would silence the scandal and reassure the kingdom that Adrian still understood his duty. Adrian refused. Then reports arrived from outside. Someone had circulated letters claiming Eleanor had deliberately pursued the king, manipulated Clara's affection, and used her position as governess to reach the throne. By afternoon, people were gathering beyond the palace gates. Some demanded Eleanor's dismissal. Others wanted to see the woman who had supposedly seduced a grieving king. Adrian watched the crowd from an upper window and made the choice he believed would protect her. Unfortunately, he made it without asking Eleanor. That evening, during a formal reception, attended by counselors, nobles, and foreign envoys, Adrian rose before the entire court. Eleanor stood near Clara. She knew something was wrong the moment Adrian refused to meet her eyes. He announced that recent rumors surrounding the royal household were without foundation. Then he added that Miss Hart would shortly be leaving her position as Princess Clara's governess. Eleanor felt the room disappear around her. Clara looked up in confusion. Seraphine remained perfectly still. Blackwood almost smiled. Eleanor understood immediately what Adrian had done. He had sacrificed her publicly to quiet the scandal. She waited until the reception ended. Then she found him alone. "You could have warned me." Adrian turned. "If I had, you would have argued. You announced my departure as though I were an embarrassment you needed removed. I am trying to keep you safe." "From whom?" "Half this kingdom, apparently." Eleanor laughed once, without humor. "No, you're protecting your crown and calling it protection because that sounds nobler." Adrian flinched, because some part of him knew she was right. He had chosen the solution kings were trained to choose: control the scandal, preserve the institution, remove the weakness. except Eleanor was not a political problem. She was a woman he had kissed because for one terrifying moment he thought he had lost her. Eleanor resigned that night. Before sunrise, she intended to be gone. Rain hammered the windows as she packed the last of her belongings. Then came the knock. Adrian entered, carrying her resignation letter. This time, there were no counselors between them, no servants, no throne, only everything they had refused to say. He asked whether she was truly leaving because of the court. Eleanor told him it no longer mattered. It matters to me. Then it should have mattered before you dismissed me in front of everyone. Adrian stepped closer. I have spent weeks avoiding rooms because you were inside them. I have changed my schedule to keep from seeing you. I have stood beside my own daughter, pretending not to notice that the sound of your voice was becoming the first thing I listened for. Eleanor's anger weakened. You should have kept avoiding me. I tried. Another step. The space between them became dangerously small. Adrian's voice lowered. If I stay here another minute, you'll want me until it hurts. Eleanor looked at him. This time, there was no clever answer to hide behind. It already does. Something broke in Adrian's expression. For a moment, neither of them remembered crowns, counsels, or consequences. Then footsteps thundered along the corridor. A terrified maid burst through the doorway. Princess Clara was gone. They ran to the child's chambers. Her bed was empty. The window stood open to the rain, and on Clara's pillow lay a single folded note. Adrian opened it. The message contained only one demand: the governess leaves alone, or the princess dies as her mother did. For 6 weeks, Eleanor had wondered who wanted her out of Valemont Palace. Now she finally understood. She had never been the real target. Clara was. The note told them where to look, without meaning to. Eleanor remembered something Clara had said weeks earlier, that her mother used to read to her in the old royal conservatory whenever the weather was warm. The building had been abandoned after Helena's death. No servants went there now. No guards regularly patrolled it, and it stood far enough from the main palace that a child could disappear inside without anyone hearing her scream. Eleanor looked at Adrian. The conservatory, he understood immediately. Within minutes, Adrian had armed guards assembled near the eastern courtyard, but the threat in Blackwood's note left little room for force. If soldiers approached openly, Clara might die. Adrian ordered them to remain behind until he gave the signal. Eleanor started toward the path with him. No, she stopped. Adrian's voice left no room for argument. You are staying here. The message specifically mentions me, which is precisely why you are not going. If Blackwood expects me and I don't appear, what do you think he will do to Clara? Adrian hated the answer, but Eleanor was already walking. The conservatory rose from the darkness like the remains of another life. Its glass roof was cracked, vines covered the stone walls, and moonlight filtered through dead branches that had once surrounded Helena's favorite roses. Inside, Clara sat on the floor beside an overturned chair. Her hands were tied. Lord Edmund Blackwood stood behind her. For the first time since Eleanor had met him, there was no polite smile. Adrian moved forward. Let her go. Blackwood almost laughed. You still think you are giving orders. Then the truth finally came. Years earlier, Blackwood had begun diverting money from royal accounts, hiding payments through false military contracts and secret trade agreements. He had also been negotiating privately with foreign nobles who wanted Adrian politically weakened. Helena discovered irregularities. At first, she believed they were accounting mistakes. Then she traced several payments directly to her cousin. She intended to tell Adrian. Blackwood could not allow that, so he used the one place no king expected betrayal. Helena's medicine. The poison was given slowly, never enough to kill her immediately, enough to weaken her, recover briefly, then weaken again until even the royal physicians believed they were watching the progression of disease. Adrian stood perfectly still. "You watched me search for doctors." Blackwood's expression barely changed. "You were easier to control when you were grieving." Clara began crying, and Blackwood looked toward her. That was when Eleanor understood the rest. Clara had seen something. As a frightened 5-year-old, she had wandered into her mother's chamber one night and seen Blackwood exchanging Helena's medicine bottle. She had not understood what she witnessed, but Helena had. After the Queen died, Clara began mentioning fragments of that night. A blue bottle, her uncle Edmund, her mother refusing medicine. Blackwood could not kill the king's daughter without inviting an investigation, so he did something quieter. He encouraged everyone to believe Clara was traumatized, difficult, and unstable. Each governess who grew too close to her was pushed away until Eleanor arrived. "You made her talk," Blackwood said. His eyes settled on Eleanor. "You taught her to remember." And once Eleanor began asking questions, Blackwood needed the palace to distrust her. The stolen pendant had been planted inside Helena's rooms to connect Eleanor to the dead queen and destroy her credibility before she uncovered anything else. Adrian's face had become frighteningly calm. "What do you want?" Blackwood tightened his grip on Clara's shoulder. "The documents, Helena's letters, the medicine records, everything that could prove what he had done." Adrian did not hesitate. "You can have them." Eleanor looked at him. Blackwood smiled. "The crown finally understands." "No," Adrian said. "A father does. He would surrender every piece of evidence if it meant Clara lived." But Eleanor had expected that. Before leaving the palace, she had quietly handed copies of Helena's letters and the medicine accounts to the captain of the royal guard, with instructions to deliver them directly to the council if she and Adrian did not return. Blackwood realized too late. His expression changed. He shoved Clara aside and ran toward a rear exit. Adrian reached his daughter first. Eleanor pulled Clara into her arms as whistles sounded outside. The royal guard surrounded the conservatory. Blackwood made it only as far as the garden wall. He was arrested before dawn. By morning, the evidence was everywhere. The missing money, the secret negotiations, Helena's letters, the poison. Queen Helena had not died from illness. She had been murdered by someone Adrian had trusted beside his throne. Blackwood's fall shook the kingdom, but it did not solve everything. The royal council still expected Adrian to restore political stability. Lady Seraphine remained the sensible marriage, and Eleanor was still a governess whose name had been dragged through scandal. Adrian tried to persuade her to remain. This time, Eleanor's decision had nothing to do with fear. She loved him. That was precisely why she had to leave. She would not become another crisis he was forced to defend before his council. Defeating Blackwood had cleared her name. It had not changed her birth. So 3 days after Clara was rescued, Eleanor Hart left Valemount Palace. And for the first time since she had arrived, King Adrian did nothing to stop her. Several weeks passed after Eleanor left Valemount Palace. She rented 2 quiet rooms above a bookseller's shop in a small town several hours from the capital, and tried to rebuild the ordinary life she had once believed she wanted. Thomas returned to school. Eleanor found temporary work teaching the bookseller's daughters. No one bowed when she entered a room. No courtiers watched how long she spoke to a man. No council debated whether she belonged beside him. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, every quiet evening reminded her of what she had left behind. Clara's laughter beneath the cedar tree, Adrian standing beside the library fire, and the terrible tenderness in his voice when he had admitted that wanting her felt like betraying a woman he had once loved. No letters came from the king. Eleanor told herself that was answer enough. Adrian had chosen duty. Perhaps that was how their story was always meant to end. Then, one cold morning, royal carriages rolled into the town. Eleanor saw the Valemont crest through the window and felt her heart stumble. But no servant came upstairs with a private summons. Instead, church bells began ringing. People poured toward the town square. By the time Eleanor reached it, she understood that Adrian had not come secretly. He had brought the kingdom with him. Members of the royal council stood near a raised platform. Noble families had traveled from the capital. Soldiers lined the square. Townspeople crowded every street. Lady Seraphine was there, and beside the platform stood Princess Clara, smiling so brightly that Eleanor nearly forgot how to breathe. Then Adrian appeared. The square fell silent. He first spoke of Blackwood. The evidence against the former chancellor had been examined publicly. His theft from the crown, his secret dealings with foreign nobles, and his role in Queen Helena's death had all been confirmed. Then Adrian did something Eleanor had never expected. Before nobles and commoners alike, he cleared her name. He told them that Eleanor Hart had uncovered evidence others had ignored, that she had protected his daughter when doing so placed her own life in danger. The woman once accused of manipulating the royal family was publicly thanked by the king for helping save it. Eleanor thought that was why he had come. Then Adrian looked toward the council. Several councillors visibly straightened. Everyone knew what was supposed to happen next. A royal engagement. Lady Seraphine. Stability restored. Instead, Adrian stepped down from the platform. He walked directly through the crowd, toward Eleanor. Whispers followed him. Eleanor could not move. When he stopped before her, she searched his face for some explanation. Then King Adrian Valemont went down on one knee. A stunned silence swept across the square. Kings were not supposed to kneel before governesses. That was precisely why Adrian did it. For weeks, everyone had reminded Eleanor how far beneath him she stood. Now he removed that distance himself. He told her that for 3 years, he had believed love was something life had taken from him. Then she had entered his palace. She had taught his daughter to laugh again. She had challenged him when everyone else bowed, and she had reminded him that a crown could command obedience, but it could never command affection. Eleanor's eyes filled. Adrian looked up at her. "You once accused me of choosing my crown over you." He paused. "I won't make that mistake twice." Then he asked her to marry him. The crowd seemed to disappear. Eleanor looked at the councillors. "And when your council objects?" Adrian smiled. "They already have." A few uncomfortable faces behind him confirmed it. "And the nobles?" Repeatedly. Despite herself, Eleanor laughed. Then she looked toward Seraphine. "And Lady Seraphine?" Seraphine raised an eyebrow. For the first time since Eleanor had met her, there was no rivalry in her expression. "For heaven's sake, Eleanor, say yes, before he causes another constitutional crisis." Laughter broke across the square. The tension finally shattered. Eleanor looked down at Adrian. "You once told me I would want you until it hurt. I was wrong." Her smile faded slightly. "How?" Adrian took her hand. "I didn't know I would want you more." That was the moment Eleanor stopped searching for reasons to leave. She said yes. Clara reached her before anyone else could. The princess threw herself into Eleanor's arms while the square erupted around them, and Adrian stood beside the two people who had finally made the palace feel like home again. Months later, Eleanor returned to those same halls, wearing ivory silk instead of a governess's modest dress. Clara carried flowers at the royal wedding. The council survived. The kingdom survived. and, to Eleanor's amusement, Seraphine eventually became one of the loudest defenders of the match. After the ceremony, Adrian and Eleanor passed beneath Queen Helena's portrait. Adrian slowed. Once, he could barely look at it without being pulled backward into guilt. Now, Eleanor simply slipped her hand into his. There was no jealousy in the gesture. Helena had been loved. That truth did not need to be erased for another love to exist. Adrian looked at the portrait one final time, then toward Eleanor and Clara waiting beneath the sunlight ahead, and he walked forward. The past had finally stopped being a prison. King Adrian had once believed the greatest proof of love was surviving its loss. Eleanor taught him something harder. Sometimes courage meant allowing yourself to love again, even when you knew exactly how much it could hurt. I hope you enjoyed Eleanor and Adrian's journey. If you did, subscribe to the channel for more captivating royal stories filled with forbidden love, betrayal, hidden secrets, dangerous choices, and unexpected twists. And before you leave, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We always love seeing just how far these royal stories travel. Thank you so much for watching, and until the next story, take care.